Thanks for joining us for CBN NewsWatch. I'm Mark Martin. Today, OSHA halts the Biden vaccine mandate for businesses, what it means for workers across America. And we're also going to tell you about Facebook, a newly named Meta, a major lawsuit and concern at where it's headed with the metaverse. Plus, inflation may rise to 7% by the end of this year, and the recently signed infrastructure bill may cause higher deficits and even higher inflation next year.
The truth is, it's not fully paid for, and as a result, it will turn out to be inflationary.
Plus, protecting the American vote against some efforts to loosen the standards could mean...
I think it's a way of, unfortunately, making it easier for folks to cheat in elections.
And how a simple act of kindness at the gas pump made an eternal difference. Those stories and more ahead on Newswatch.
This is CBN Newswatch.
The Food and Drug Administration is set to expand vaccine booster shots to all adults, and Pfizer is asking federal regulators to authorize its new COVID pill. The news comes as cases spike across the country, and the president's vaccine mandate faces an uphill battle. Our Charlene Aaron has the story.
The order, which would have gone into effect January 4th, calls for businesses with 100 or more employees to either require vaccinations or weekly testing for the unvaccinated. OSHA said it was complying with a court order. Last week, a 3-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit kept its hold in place on the mandate, calling the government's order, quote, fatally flawed, and saying it raises serious constitutional concerns. In addition to the legal challenges to the president's federal mandate, protests against state mandates are also taking place.
Raise your hand if you support your neighbor's right to decide whether or not to vaccinate their child, and you simply ask for the same in return.
In California, parents and teachers rallied at the state capitol against Governor Gavin Newsom's vaccine mandate for students.
For a woman, it's hard for me to tell her who birthed this child what to do with that child.
Yeah.
Across the country, the number of COVID cases have increased 27% in the past 3 weeks. But as the numbers rise, new treatments are on the way. Pfizer this week asking regulators for approval for an experimental pill, which promises success in combating COVID.
Within 3 days of the symptoms, you have now 89% protection from disease leading to hospitalization with our medicines, and the data indicate 100% protection from death. And even if you start the medicine 5 days after having contracted the disease, COVID-19 with symptoms, you have now 85% protection.
And an advisory panel will discuss expanding eligibility for COVID booster shots on Friday, and they could be available by the weekend. Moderna and Pfizer have filed for emergency use authorization for their boosters to be given to all adults 18 and up. Some states are already offering booster shots to everyone 18 and up. While more treatments are becoming available for those who want them, the president's vaccine mandate could face a very difficult road ahead in the legal system, with challenges likely to go to the Supreme Court. Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Austria took what its leader, Chancellor Alexander Schallenberg, called the dramatic step of implementing a nationwide lockdown for unvaccinated people who have not contracted the COVID-19 virus. One Twitter user who goes by the name Bernie's Tweets shared video of Austria's Interior Minister Karl Nehammer's stern warning to the Austrian people. The post says every person in Austria must be aware that they can be checked by the police at any time, Interior Minister. Citizens owned now by the state. Today it's vaccines, but tomorrow? Max Blumenthal, editor of the Gray Zone News, tweeted a 44-second video clip of Austrian police checking department store patrons and others for proof of their COVID-19 vaccinations. He posted, "Austrian police hunt for the unvaccinated." He went on to say the human rights industry, the EU, U.S., and much of the international left are silent, if not quietly approving. And you can see the full story at cbnnews.com. A whistleblower at the Federal Bureau of Investigation released an internal email to the House Judiciary Committee showing the FBI is using terrorist tracking tools on parents who have spoken out at local school board meetings. It's further evidence of what most parents are calling extreme government overreach, stemming from an order from Attorney General Merrick Garland's controversial basically deploying the FBI in response to the National School Boards Association demanding action against parents. Republican Congressman Jim Jordan wrote Garland about the damaging email, saying this disclosure provides specific evidence that federal law enforcement operationalized counterterrorism tools at the behest of a left-wing special interest group against concerned parents. The fallout from whistleblower revelations in those so-called Facebook papers not over yet. Ohio's Attorney General has launched a lawsuit against Meta Platforms, the company formerly known as Facebook. It claims the company repeatedly misled the public and investors about the harmful effects its products have on minors. The lawsuit seeks more than $100 billion in damages and demands significant internal reforms. Meta says the suit is without merit. Faith Nation's Jenna Browder spoke with Kara Frederick, research fellow in technology policy at the Heritage Foundation, about this suit and about where the newly named Meta is heading with the metaverse.
I know you used to work at Facebook and have spent years in the tech industry. Do you think the site and its newly renamed parent, Meta, are dishonest?
I think this was a rebranding exercise when it came to Facebook now becoming Meta, sort of like Google did with Alphabet, but clearly Facebook has a big PR problem following them now, especially regarding the Wall Street Journal expose and the whistleblower documents that were leaked. But what surrounds and why people are saying Facebook is being dishonest, in particular the Ohio AG, is the fact that Facebook conducted a bunch of studies, internal research, that really found that their products were harming especially young users. And they knew this, and they still moved forward with plans to create an under 13 Instagram. It wasn't until the Wall Street Journal actually exposed them through the whistleblower documents that they said, okay, well, we'll give a little pause here. So bottom line, Facebook knew their products were harmful and they kept going anyway. And in particular, they kept going to target young teens, young adults, and even preteens as a new demographic to advertise to. So that to me is inexcusable. They knew, they kept going. They only stopped once those documents got out in the open.
Yeah, we saw, the study that it's very, Instagram in particularly, very harmful for young girls. Kara, should the government be doing more, like filing suits like this one, to help rein in the company?
I definitely think there's a role for governments at all levels to play. State governments in particular, the federal government too. States are traditionally the labs of democracy, right? So let's let them run. I'm really intrigued by what Florida Governor DeSantis is doing when he wrote into law that no Zuckerbucks could be used for election interference. So that's one way of doing it, reining them in through these lawsuits. Another way of doing it, the federal government can also reform Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in 1996. And when it basically gives these platforms freedom from liability for what's on their platform. It renders them platforms, not publishers. Yet if you take a look at Twitter and you see all of the editorializing and the labeling they're doing, particularly that doesn't redound to the benefit of conservatives, they're clearly publishers and they should be punished. They should be open to lawsuits in those instances. So federal government has a role to play here, but those states, I love that they're leaping out ahead. They're taking action. They're responding to the grassroots and to parents that are fed up and saying enough is enough. These devices, these platforms, they are not helping the souls of our children, and something needs to be done to rein them in. Good on the states for moving out on this.
Kara, just a few seconds left, but I want to ask you, what concerns you most about Meta and its various platforms like Facebook and Instagram moving forward?
Oh, Meta is a whole bag of worms. It is, as Christians, we know that we are body-soul composites. What the metaverse seeks to do is remove our bodies completely. The Federalist wrote a great article how we're supposed to worship in the metaverse now without our bodies. That is completely antithetical to being a Christian. So what these companies, what this is doing to our souls, it's dehumanizing us, and it intends to. That's what concerns me most, and we should resist at all costs.
All right, Kara Frederick with the Heritage.
Well, coming up, the realities of inflation and the causes behind it. There are many, and what needs to happen to turn it around. Welcome back to Newswatch. You'll be spending 21% more on your Thanksgiving meal this year than you did in 2020. According to The Balance, the cost of potatoes and turkey are up more than 8%. Cranberries have also skyrocketed, up 28.5%. And the cost for a ham this year is up a whopping 62.5%. Why this huge jump in prices, making this one of the most expensive Thanksgivings ever? Appearing on this week's episode of The Global Lane, Stockton University professor of finance Dr. Michael Busler says supply chain shortages are only partially to blame.
It's not just caused by supply chain disruptions. There are other reasons why we're getting inflation, not just in the food we buy, but in virtually everything. So how bad is the problem? Based on last month's CPI number from October 2020 to October 2021, 1 year, prices are up 6.2%. That's the highest inflation, 12-month inflation we've had in more than 30 years. The Biden administration and the Federal Reserve both say this is due to supply chain disruptions. And as soon as the supply chain disruptions are resolved, prices will return to normal. I don't agree with that because there are 4 other reasons why we're seeing inflation, not just in food, but in virtually everything that we buy. And even after the supply chain problems are resolved, unfortunately, those 4 problems are still going to be here. So what are they? Number one, the Biden administration would like the country to use less fossil fuels. By restricting the supply at a time when demand is growing, energy prices keep going up. And not only will we pay more for gasoline and oil, but heating oil and natural gas, but also manufacturers will pay more for energy to produce their products. That'll drive prices up too. Even retailers will pay more because most of their goods are brought in by truck, and trucks will be paying higher fuel costs. So number one is energy prices rising. Number two, for whatever reason, a large number of people who were laid off during the pandemic are not returning to work. There's over 3 million people who have simply dropped out of the labor force and are not going back to work. In order to induce those people to come back to work, businesses had to raise wages, mostly on lower income workers. Well, once the lower income workers get an increase in wages, then people who have been there a while say, hey, the new person is making almost as much as I am, so I want to raise. And you end up getting this wage inflation. Once that happens, then labor costs go up for business, so they have to raise their prices 8 or 9%. And then the next year, labor wants even a larger increase, and you get into this wage price spiral, which is also driving up prices. Third reason, the federal government has deficit spent, that is, they spent more money than they took in the last 2 years, almost $6 trillion. On a $22 trillion annual economy, that will lead to pure inflation and an expansionary policy by the Federal Reserve. Those are driving inflation up. Even when the supply chain is resolved, we're still going to have those things present, and I'm very nervous about what future inflation will look like.
Okay, Dr. Busler, the president expects the infrastructure bill that he signed into law Monday will ease inflation. Will new spending ease these alarming price increases? What do you think?
No. If you deficit spend more, you create more demand in the economy, and that will lead to more, not less, inflation. Now, he says this won't add to the deficit and won't add to deficit spending because it'll be fully paid for. But the truth is it's not fully paid for. They're not going to be able to raise taxes by the amount they want to increase in spending, so it's not fully paid for. And as a result, it will turn out to be inflationary.
Finally, how will the year end for the economy? A better than average Christmas season? What do you expect for 2022?
I expect this Christmas season, assuming there's enough supply, the retail sales to be very strong throughout the rest of the year. Going into next year, I'm very nervous. because I'm afraid inflation will remain high both in November and December. I think we'll end the year with about a 7% inflation rate, even higher than we have now. Going into next year, eventually the Federal Reserve is going to have to do something to address the inflation problem. And that something is to reduce that bond buying program and raise interest rates. But the longer they wait to do it, the more drastic the action will become. My biggest fear for next year and going forward is we run into a problem where we have inflation, we have large government budget deficits, we have a huge public debt, which we're going to have to address the first week in December of this year. If business can't get labor, because we have somewhat of a labor shortage, and they can't get capital, because there may be a capital shortage, they can't expand. So what you end up with is an inflationary economy that business can't expand and remain stagnant. That leads to a stagflation problem that we haven't seen since the late 1970s. That's my biggest fear going forward.
America is deeply divided over what's needed to protect voter and election integrity. Hans von Spakovsky, who previously served on the Federal Election Commission, says there needs to be some major corrections. First of all, what is the greatest threat to our elections today?
The ease with which fraud can be committed undetected and then not investigated and not prosecuted by election officials and law enforcement officials.
What would you say are some of the biggest fraud cases out there that you've documented?
I wrote a case study years ago about a very large election fraud case that was prosecuted by the Justice Department in Chicago. Almost every kind of fraud occurred in that election. Over 60 individuals were prosecuted and convicted of election fraud. Two other just quick examples. 1997, the Miami mayor's race was overturned by a judge. The judge estimated there had been at least 5,000 fraudulent ballots cast in that election. And don't forget, just 3 years ago, 2018, the 9th congressional district race in North Carolina was overturned and a new election held because of absentee ballot fraud in that election.
You've written a book, Hans, with John Fund called Our Broken Elections, How the Left Changed the Way You Vote. You outline changes that need to take place. What are they?
Well, we have a whole list of recommendations at the end of the book after we've documented the problems. And it's everything, it's just common sense things, such as requiring an ID when you vote, both in person and through the absentee balloting process. Actually verifying the residential address that someone claims as to where they're living, when they're registering to vote, verifying citizenship to make sure that somebody really is a U.S. citizen when they're registering to vote, and taking very basic steps to maintain the accuracy of voter registration rolls to make sure that when people die or when they move out of state, they're taken off the rolls so that their names can't be used to cast illegal ballots.
Did the contentious presidential election in 2020 prompt this book?
Well, no, John Fund and I have been writing about this for a long time. In fact, our first book came out almost a decade ago. But last year's election really accelerated the unfortunate push by folks on the progressive left to change the rules and basically get rid of the kind of safety and security protocols that states have in place. And they use COVID-19 as excuse. I mean, an example of that is that they've been pushing a bill, trying to get a bill passed through Congress, H.R. 1, that would ban or void all state voter ID laws. I mean, there is no reason to do that other than to make it easy to cheat in elections.
Why are some of these new rules so dangerous?
Well, take what I just talked about, the trying to wipe out voter ID laws. At the very same time, the left has been pushing same-day voter registration. That means that states would have to allow you to walk into a polling place on Election Day, register, and immediately vote. When you combine this with the fact that they can't ask you for an ID, it would make it very easy for someone to go from one polling place to another, register under false name, vote, and then go to another polling place and do it again. And even if election officials are suspicious, they can't ask you for an ID.
And looking further into the voter ID issue, why are some of the most basic election laws, like voter ID, being challenged in our politically divided culture? You talked a little bit about this, but delve into it more with us.
Sure. You know, there's an interesting dichotomy here. The American public overwhelmingly, for example, thinks that requiring an ID to verify your identity when you vote is common sense, and they support it. And by the way, the polling shows that's regardless of which political party they support or what their ethnic or racial background is. Unfortunately, the progressive left, very liberal advocacy organizations, and Democratic leaders like Joe Biden and others are constantly railing that voter ID is voter suppression. That's not true, but I think they do that. I mean, the only reasons can be that, one, they're trying to scare voters into thinking that someone's trying to keep them from voting because they think that'll get their voters out. But second, I think it's a way of, unfortunately, making it easier for folks to cheat in elections, which is not a good thing.
And quickly, we're almost out of time, but what do you think we should do before the next election?
I think more states in the upcoming legislative sessions in the states should pass election reforms the way Texas, Georgia, and Florida did at the beginning of this year. Other states need to follow their lead and put in the kind of remedies that those states did.
Okay, Hans von Spakovsky with the Heritage Foundation and author of Our Broken Elections, How the Left Changed the Way You Vote. Thanks for your time, sir.
Sure thing, anytime.
Coming up, meeting God at the gas pump, how one church's idea to meet a practical need actually led people to Christ. Members of one Washington, D.C. church helped drivers put gas in their vehicles Saturday, and they witnessed 8 people give their lives to Christ. Greater Mount Calvary Holy Church provided $20 worth of gas to nearly 250 cars, a project the church called Gas on God.
It's our giving season, and what better way to kick it off than to give gas on God?
That's awesome. For 3 hours Saturday, volunteers filled up tanks and hearts while also providing prayer and live music. The good gesture did have one negative side effect. It backed up traffic for 6 blocks. It's a program for the church to provide relief and assistance to those in need. Of course, the positives are that it fueled lifelong faith for those who accepted Christ, showed God's love to all, and was definitely spreading goodwill this holiday season. And that's going to do it for this edition of CBN News Watch, a great way to end the show. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Have a great day.